Hey everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Exploring Kodawari. We are joined this time by our friend and accomplished composer Nathan Hudson. Nathan recently graduated with a PhD in composition from Stony Brook University, which is where me and my co-host Yanka met him. But he's got a long and impressive bio that you can read on his website, which I linked in the episode notes. In this episode, we talked about what it means to major in music composition, how a composer goes about finding their voice, and we talked about the creative process more generally. Where do ideas come from? How does a composer develop those ideas into finished pieces? We also talked about the art of craft beer and coffee. Nathan has worked in specialty coffee back when he lived in New York City. So we talked about the Kodawari vibe from the coffee world. Why do people pursue the perfect cup of coffee or the perfect espresso? And more generally, we talked about what it means to pursue the ideal. That's pretty much it for now. Hope you're having a good day and enjoy the episode. Boom. All right, Nathan Hudson, welcome to Exploring Kodawari.
Hello. Yes. So happy to be here.
I probably have introduced you already a little bit, but I wanted to start with the word Kodawari. Do you remember where we first learned that word?
Do I remember where we first learned that word? No, I don't, but I want to be reminded, so please tell me.
All right, so it was So first off, describe how we first met in terms of both being into coffee and in grad school.
Wow. So it was a wild time. So I moved from Georgia up to New York for my graduate studies in music composition on Long Island, and I get up there, and I was this big shot down south with coffee. I used to sell coffee in my undergrad. I used to make French presses and pump them full of those hazelnut syrups and sell them for $4 a cup. I thought I was the coffee kingpin. So
say the name of your coffee place from Georgia too, because it was you got.
We were called Espresso Espressivo. We had some great
for a music geek and coffee geek. That's just spot on.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a good name, and we had some great artwork too done by Victor Boyda. But anyways, so I get to New York and I think, okay, well, no one here knows about coffee because I didn't know anything about New York, so I assumed that they knew nothing about coffee. So I had an email sent out to everyone in the whole department of music. So it was all students, staff, and faculty. And basically it was one of the most snobby emails looking back on it now. I was just yeah, hi. So I'm kind of into coffee and I doubt that you are. And so I want to educate you. I just assumed that everyone had no idea and they all just drank Folgers and thought it was great. So I sent this email. Well, I got some replies back.
You got
it's
two,
when you
right?
Post something on two, right? Yeah. It's when you post something on social media and think, oh, no one's going to comment on this. Oh, they will.
Mm-hmm. Someone will.
There's going to be someone. And so one of the replies was by this one trumpet player named Chris Scanlon, and the other was from you, Luke Bauslav. And you were like, okay, yeah, I kind of know about coffee. And so I held this initial session where I talked about all the boring parts about coffee that really don't add to a person who's getting into it for the first time. It doesn't add into their enjoyment of the product. But Luke saw through that. You saw through that. And so then through that, we kind of turned our mutual love for coffee into this thing called Coffee Tuesday, which happened on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. It just recently ended, actually. I have killed the Facebook page officially.
I saw that Facebook notified me. It was and by the way, our Coffee Tuesday Facebook page, for some reason, got mixed up with some cafe in Japan or somewhere.
Yeah,
I think it was South Korea.
South Korea? Because people kept checking in there and giving us ratings, and I'm like, damn, this thing's taken off. We didn't do anything.
5-star. I know. And so to kind of narrow the story a bit, we saved all the scientific coffee talk for back in our apartments, which trust me, all that talk was still there and it was strong. But then we kind of ran this coffee business. We blew a few fuses. We made a little coin. We bought some
we plugged
food
into this
with our money.
Outlet in the floor. I remember one time I was heating up water. And I plugged in a, what is it called? The power strip into the floor so we could get a couple kettles going, the coffee grinder and all this. And I plugged into the floor and sparks started flying. I was like, uh-oh. Meanwhile, we're technically doing something that the campus would deem illegal. We're
it's definitely illegal.
selling
Absolutely illegal.
coffee
100% illegal.
without any permit, right? I mean, we were calling it donations, I think, which was helpful legally. But we basically just had people that were chairs of the department that enjoyed our coffee, so they were cool with it.
And then we even went one step further because sort of after this was done in our school of music, I actually began working in the coffee industry in Manhattan. And one thing I learned was that selling coffee has its kind of own licenses. But if you add in food, that adds in like a whole nother layer. And so, of course, what had we done like the year before? We added a cookie guy.
Right. Yeah.
So he'd bring in his cookies. His name is Joey Bohegian. He's an excellent composer, and he made really bad grape jelly cookies, but everything else was great.
Oh, he made amazing cookies. Like the sugar cookies were my favorite.
Once cookies got involved, Bianca was like down.
Like now
with
I'm
Coffee
interested
Tuesdays.
in. Yeah, I'm gonna live in.
Except for that one time. Do y'all remember that time when we had a decorate your own cookie
Yes,
event,
I do remember.
and we had peppermint icing, or was it strawberry icing, or something that was just bad?
I don't remember the specific one, but I remember a couple. I mean, various things we did in that endeavor were disastrous. I just love the idea that it was called. I don't know what we originally called it, Coffee Tuesdays, and then we changed it to.
I think it was just called Coffee Tuesdays.
Like Coffee Thursdays. And then people started picking up on that name, but then we had to switch it to a Wednesday, and then it eventually ended back on a Tuesday. So people would show up on random days, like I'm just in the student lounge, not having set up all my equipment, and they'd be like, "What's going on, coffee? You know, where's the coffee? You know, coffee boy."
And not just students either. You know, I mean, a few of our kind of A-tier patrons are people who are very respected musicians, and they would get like a little frustrated if it was like a Thursday, but we were just there 2 days ago. So it was a complicated issue. And then also I recall there were a couple times where, as an organization, we hosted what's called a coffee cupping, which is like a coffee tasting, almost like a wine tasting, but for coffee. However, it's a little problematic to send an email to like an entire school of music where you say like, "Hey, come to this cupping of this thing," because that kind of gets passed around and like it's really not a good look.
Yeah,
but it is the word that's associated with it, and
it's not a popular term for coffee. Like people don't know that's what coffee tasting is called. Mm-hmm. Like if you say, "Hey, come do a wine tasting," everybody knows what you mean. But if you say do a coffee cupping, they're like, "Oh, I know what coffee is. What are we cupping exactly?"
Yeah, and it actually kind of has me think a little bit about how coffee companies are cupping their coffees nowadays, because kind of the cupping process sort of necessitates a lot of people all tasting the same coffee by dipping their spoon into the same cup over and over multiple times with these violent inhalations as they think about it. I wonder how coffee companies Yeah. No, like I'm curious if there's actually just kind of like one person whose kind of flavor profiles kind of, I'm
sure they have to adjust
dominant force in these companies. Yeah. Anyways, so that's how we met.
We met through this shared geekery of coffee. And
I think that's how I met you guys too, pretty much, right? Like I started like hanging out.
Yeah,
there.
maybe me and Yanka. Yanka's my fiance, if this is your first episode. But we probably met at this Coffee Tuesday thing because you came in and you were like this cute little like, "Hello, I want coffee."
That's cute. Yeah, you were the coffee guy. You guys were the coffee guys.
I mean, it was the place to be.
It was.
In that music building. It wasn't the place to be like if you have a lot of places to be, but if you're stuck in graduate music school, it was the place to be. But anyways, when we were hanging out and stuff, we got into coffee. We shared coffee knowledge, and I remember you sharing Peter Giuliano with me, that just the whole Specialty Coffee Association of America and whatever. And he was on a Joe Rogan podcast where he mentioned this word Kodawari in the context of this guy in Japan who owns Bear Pond Espresso. And he was saying like this pursuit of perfection, like finding the perfect cup. And this guy doesn't open his shop if he doesn't like how the espresso is tasting that day. And he gets there 2 hours early. He's got the perfect classical music playing, like, and that sort of spark of like chasing after a craft, attending to all the details, right? That's what specialty coffee is about.
Okay. Yep. I remember that now. And I think it's something that's really attractive, like about the word, is that in coffee or in music or in, I mean, like a lot of pursuits, you kind of strive like for this perfection, but the part that's so attractive, like the part that you lust for, is the fact that you won't ever get there.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, which I think is awesome. It's cool.
And it's all packed
exciting,
into one
and-
word.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
so like,
exactly.
what would be the perfect cup of coffee? It's like, you know, and it fits into the music framework pretty well too. It's like, what would be the perfect piece or the perfect performance or whatever. So, but something just to complement your personality, you're very much like that about many different diverse things, right? So you're into coffee, you're into craft beer, you're obviously into music because that's your career. Did you just graduate, by the way? Are you officially a doctor of music, whatever?
In December. Yep.
In December?
In December.
Well,
Congrats.
you will graduate in December.
Wait, he did
No,
graduate
I
this
have
year.
graduated
Okay,
in
well,
December.
congrats on that.
Yep, I'm done. Thank you.
Dr. Hudson.
Dr. Hudson.
That's right.
I have a rash I want to show you later if you can help me with that now that you're a doctor.
I can.
You can help me? Uh-oh.
Yes, I can. And one real quick note too. If for any of our coffee loving listeners out there are curious to read about this kind of pursuit of excellence as it relates to coffee directly, there's a great book by Michelle Weissman called God in a Cup.
Ah, yes.
I'm looking at it right now.
which-
Yes, isn't that over there?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Dude, it's right here in our
I lent
bookshelf.
that to you.
Yeah,
Is that my copy?
yeah, it's got to be your copy because I didn't buy it.
Anyways, in this
Well-
book, it's a
Sorry.
great book. And the basic idea is that there's a reporter, Michelle, who kind of follows along a few coffee roasters who were involved with a cupping of this coffee that got extremely high marks in a coffee competition with kind of how coffee's graded on a scale. And there was one coffee that had a score that just nobody had ever seen. And the people who were there actually had these like godlike experiences with this coffee. But what's so interesting is the book is actually about how that experience for these roasters turned them into something other. And the book kind of actually follows each of their journeys after, and how once they've tasted that cup of coffee, that cup of coffee, it actually kind of is a negative, and it kind of corrupts them in a way. And she highlights this in a very meaningful and a powerful and a very eloquent way. And also, you know, the coffee that was there, that was scored so high, it didn't even get 100. It was like a 98 out of 100.
Well, what
So,
would 100 be, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's
no one
the problem
knows.
with
So-
scales, right?
Anyways,
But yeah, you're like that with obviously with your career in music. You're a go-getter. You do things and you actually do them. Like you have ideas and then you do them. You're into that. You're like that with video games, craft beer.
Yeah.
I'm sure other things I don't even know that you're into. You know, you're pouring lattes with latte art in the morning, not just, you know, even just doing a pour over, right? So what motivates that energy? Because it's probably a shared energy, whether it's in your main career or a side interest, right?
yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that I had to kind of come to terms with, especially in a financial way, because
I.e., you can't keep buying craft beer all the time.
Well, yeah, because, you know, I drink coffee every day, often multiple times a day. I drink beer often. I wouldn't say every day, but I drink it often, right? I enjoy it. I engage with music all the time. And so why settle, right? Why ever let yourself willingly have something that's not the best that it can be? However, about 2 or 3 years ago, I acquired a beer glass from a brewery called Tired Hands, which is in Pennsylvania. And the beer glass is very simple. And all it says is, "This is the best beer I've ever tasted," on the glass.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of had a shift for me in my perspective, because, you know, I used to hunt these rare beers, these whales, we call them, right? I used to pay top dollar for these geisha coffees all the time, which was a poor financial choice. And, you know, I used to do all these things. And then I realized, you know, having those things is great because I want to always know that they exist. That's important for me, like to know that there's this something else above, which is exactly what this podcast's name reflects. However, there's that flip side that also is a part of that, where understanding that there's this other that exists does not diminish what's in my glass.
Right.
And whatever I have in my glass at that moment is the best beer because I chose for it to be there. Or it's the best coffee because I chose for it to be in my cup. All these things. So it was a real beautiful realization for me.
It's much wiser that they put that slogan on the glass and not on their can of beer, which would be a bit arrogant.
For sure.
Yes.
But I know what you're
True.
saying. It's sort of like what Yanka and I love doing, or, love about meditation, which is it makes you not always chase after the future, the thing that's better in the future, but just, be happy now, the sort of everything's perfect now idea.
But I think it's really interesting though, like to always have that carrot. Like, do y'all think that kind of like having a carrot in front of you and knowing that there's something that you could be doing,
yes,
is that meaningful or is it not?
Oh, it absolutely is. I would say like I function like that more personally. Like I always need to have a drive for something, like in whatever I'm doing. So I definitely need that carrot. And then something about your personality that I really respect, I think, is that like you always like are really like determined if you're like doing something, like a project, something. I always like seen you just, following that carrot like so successfully. And I think, I function a similar way. I don't know.
I think the key is you just have to know it's a carrot. A lot of people are chasing a carrot and they don't realize it's a carrot on a stick. You just have to know it's on a stick that's attached to you to keep them to drill the metaphor into the ground. And so, I'm chasing this carrot because I need to move in a direction and I might as well move where the carrots are. Am I ruining this metaphor?
No, I think you're spot on. And it takes me back to some advice I was given when I transitioned into my doctoral candidacy. So about like a year and a half ago, I had my advisor offer me some advice, which really
That's a good thing for an advisor to do. Advise you.
And it really shaped my kind of compositional and my musical ethos. And he said, you have to identify what the ideal is, right? Look at that carrot. Say, cool, I acknowledge that you're a carrot. What about you makes you an attractive carrot? Is it just the fact that you're hanging on the stick? No, it's a lot more than that. And so breaking down what makes your ideal then allows you to, in anything you do, say, how many boxes am I checking? And it begins to offer meaning to a lot more in our lives than you kind of think, right? So for example, I'm a composer. I lived in New York for like 7 years and I'm 28. If I was going to be the it composer in New York, it would have happened a long time ago. So I had to kind of say, okay, acknowledging that, what can I do? What kind of things can I make in my community? What kind of meaningful relationships can I have? What kind of art can I create to check enough boxes that I say, yeah, you know what? These things are still a part of that carrot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really healthy way to think about success or about what it means to chase that carrot. Honestly, it's a lot more helpful to view it as like a pixelated carrot and take pixels out and then make something new with it,
Right. The metaphor that we used in episode 1 of the podcast, where we were just talking about the concept of Kodawari, is I don't know if you've heard this term, circumnambulation. It's sort of like a way. It's a term that Carl Jung, the psychologist, used to talk about self-development. And the idea would be like, instead of the metaphor of a carrot on a stick, you're in this like labyrinth maze, and the center would be where the carrot is. And you're trying to get to the carrot, which would be like the ideal of something, whether that's the ideal piano playing, the ideal composition, the ideal human being. And you find yourself aiming towards that center, but then the direction changes or reality forces you to change direction, and now you're going in a different place, and then you hit a dead end, you have to turn around and go back, and you end up doing this circling of this ideal without ever actually penetrating to get to the center where the carrot is or whatever is in the center. And I think the idea is just like that the carrot or the center of this maze is transcendent. It's pixelated because it's a little blurry because you don't actually fully understand it. Like, what is the ideal composition, You can't.
Well, Carl Jung, I think, is a really interesting person to bring up because I read some of his work when I was doing my doctoral colloquium, which in the piece I was writing about, a composer was using a lot of quotation, a lot of kind of like direct imitation of this sort of other composer's work. And Jung talks about this as a problem, and talks about how if you are imitating someone, you sort of have to know that you're imitating them when you create something new. Mm-hmm. I forget all the specifics about what he was saying, but I can send you like a link to the article. It's fascinating, but I think you're spot on.
Yeah. So obviously, in terms of specifically music, that's your main carrot, or maybe your main carrot is something more personal, but in terms of what you probably spend most of your time doing. So can you just describe to the music muggles listening? We call non-musicians music muggles. Because like if we were doing
using the word muggle is kind of problematic now after recent statements, but I won't get into that.
Oh, that is true.
It's still a great word, and the alliteration alone means I can't get rid of it.
Fair enough.
So like for non-musicians, what can you describe like what it means to get a degree in composition? Like what are you actually doing?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? And I spend my summers often teaching high schoolers. I do a lot of marching band education. And when I'm talking with these young people, it's really interesting because they sometimes, even when they're in high school, a junior or a senior, they don't even know that you can go to undergraduate college for music.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I did. And it's in high school.
Yeah. And it's something that you think like, oh, it's not a real, like career path. Like it's not listed on the pamphlet, like for the college I want to go to. But they exist. There are a lot of them. They are international. They're everywhere. Now, as a composer, it's a different kind of thing. And it was something that I had to grapple with as an undergraduate. I play trumpet. That's my main instrument. And when I was looking for undergraduate schooling, I was hell-bent on going for composition. But I realized that there weren't many places that offered an undergraduate degree in composition. And it kind of bummed me out. And it actually kind of had me think like, okay, is this something I really want to do? And then when I got to undergrad and I realized that a lot of programs only offer kind of like the higher, like the master's or a PhD in composition, although undergraduate degrees are becoming more common. But a reason why is because to be a composer, you kind of have to have experience being a performer often, right? Now, there, of course, are exceptions. There are very famous exceptions. But I think it was for me very healthy. And so what kind of a master's or a PhD in composition means is you're just learning how to the most successful presentation of yourself you have to uncover when you're in school. Because you have a freedom, you have a place to try things, to experiment with your voice compositionally. You get to make mistakes, you get to make, you get to uncover discoveries about yourself, all these things. And it's about you trying to more successfully present yourself. You are not there to change your voice. That was like a 1960s, 1970s thing where everybody wanted people to have the same voice. You had the Columbia University compositional voice. You had the Juilliard compositional voice. You had the Michigan compositional voice. Thankfully, that is no longer a thing. And now
that seems like it's just so not artistically true to force people into not. You should be helping people discover their own voice, not saying this is this, like the technique of like orchestration. How do you write for different instruments? Like I understand that can be, certain styles and schools of thought and whatnot, but it seems to me like the artistic part, like the deeper art of composing music should be about like self-discovery, like what feels, whatever artistically true. I don't know what that means ultimately. It just means, obviously it's not literally true, but it means some kind of honest expression of something.
No, I think you're right, and it's an interesting thing about being in college for composition because it's sort of equal parts how to find your own voice, and also equal parts how to later, when you are teaching, how can you help somebody else uncover their voice, right? I'll use an example. So our department chair at our college that we all went to, his name is Perry Goldstein. He's an excellent composer. He's an excellent musician. He did his doctorate at Columbia University back in the 70s when the way that he writes music now, which is tonal, it's playful, it's lively, would have been very frowned upon. And his teacher, which, I can say his name, Mario Davidovsky, okay? His name kind of rings true with this kind of like hyper serial, hyper controlled music. And while
by the way, for non-musicians, the serial music is like where every detail is accounted for in like a calculated way, not so much what you might think of as like classical orchestral music or movie scores, where it's about the effect or the affect,
Yep. And so for Perry, when he was there, which, that is a very prestigious institution to have gone to, he knew he wanted to get his degree from there. So he had to fit a mold. But the moment he was done, he went back to how he wanted to write. And he recounted to me one time in a lesson that he had a call from his past teacher. And he said, "Oh, Perry, are you still writing that tonal music?" And he's like, "Yeah, I am." And that's really interesting, right? And thankfully, it's not really that way anymore. And so it's just really interesting because composition in college is about each person uncovering the most successful way to present themselves and how to create something that can meaningfully explain that or show that to a group of either performers or an audience member, depending on the kind of music or the idiom. So, yeah, that's all I've got to say about that.
Like for us performing musicians, our day-to-day practicing is like maintaining certain technical skills on the one front, and then on the more spiritual front, like maintaining inspiration and why we're doing it, why are we practicing 3 hours a day kind of thing. Is there like the technical aspect to composition where you have to keep your skills sharp? Is there any like daily routine stuff that you do, like like voice leading exercise, or is that more like once you have it, you have it?
Yeah, so I kind of have a multi-pronged answer to that. So
multi-pronged, woo!
So especially during this time of isolation, that's been a big problem for a lot of composers, because we kind of often say that we need external stimuli to then give us something that we can respond to musically. Well, when you're in isolation, that kind of gets cut off. And so for a lot of composers, you have seen them post on social media, or they've written really eloquently about this kind of block. And it's something that I think is completely healthy. However, there are things I think that one can do if you are in isolation to kind of still keep the creative process going. And I think that there has to be a balance between acknowledging that it's not the best time to get stimuli, but also saying, taking the stimuli I have, what can I do with it? And so some things that I found that work for me are, I love revisiting old pieces, right? Because as a composer, oftentimes I write when I'm paid to write. And that sounds kind of bad, but it's the reality about it.
It's your career.
And so when I'm not paid to write, and when I'm not paid to write, how do I keep writing? And so I love to go back and look at old pieces and say, you know what? I'm going to go back and hear this piece I wrote like 8 years ago and think, okay, I'm going to find one bar. I'm going to make some decisions. As a composer, I love making decisions. That's like a big part about being a composer. I'm going to go back and make some decisions about one bar and see what that does to the piece. See if that necessitates me to make any other choices later on. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But just kind of triggering that part of my brain and my creative process is enough on a day where I feel kind of bogged down by not having those external stimuli to at least feel like I made a connection in my brain, right? So that's something that is really healthy for me. 2, listening to music is really interesting, right? Because as a composer and as a performer or as a musicologist, someone who kind of studies music as a career, like the really high academic side, listening to music is something that's kind of necessary, right? It's paramount. However, for myself as a composer, whenever I hear a piece of music or I watch a movie that has music, or I'm in the car and I hear something on the radio, oftentimes it's sort of like 40%, okay, here's what I like about that. And then it's 60%, here's what I would change about it if I could. Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting, right?
That's almost your technique practice, right?
Yeah, and I often tell young students, like, hey, have you ever played a piece in band class or an orchestra class or sang a song in choir that you're like, wow, I hate this so much? And they're like, oh yeah, for sure.
They're like, yeah, most
Yeah.
of everything.
Yeah. And I asked them like, okay, cool. What about it didn't you like? And they're like, oh, well, I thought that the ending sucked. And I'm like, cool, let's talk about that. Why was it not something that you engaged with? We begin to break it down. And then once we have these ideas, I say, cool, let's try to make it a better ending. And that right there is a great way to introduce young people into composition. And it's a great way for people who are professionals in the field to kind of stay active in the creative process, right?
Yeah, it gets their gears turning in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that for me, it has been really helpful during this time because there's not those external stimuli.
What do you mean by external stimuli? Give me some examples of what you would normally be, you mean like the things that spark your creative juices kind of vibe?
Yeah. I'm not around people. I'm not having conversations. I'm not out there like teaching in person. I'm not out there eating great food. I'm not out there seeing amazing sights. All these
meeting
things
random people at breweries or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a big problem for composers. And so those few things I found are helpful during a time like this to find a way to always be moving forward. I'm also very thankful here to have a piano where I exist, but also I do it on my trumpet or just anything. I love just making sound,
Yeah.
I'll be making my coffee in the morning and all of a sudden I'll kind of take my coffee cup and I'll accidentally with, my little coffee stick go.
Yeah, I found a random old Snapchat. Snapchat will alert me, like randomly be like, here's a video from 3 years ago today or something. And one of them was me in my old house. Yanka was there and you were there. And I don't know if you remember this, but my fridge had some glass bottles on top of it. And the vibration of the fridge was vibrating the glass bottles together in such a way that it was creating like a sort of beat. And then we started adding to that beat on the table. And like for at least 20 seconds, it was pretty dope. I'll send you the Snapchat. You would find it funny.
No, yeah, please do.
That's funny.
And building awareness for things like that just kind of happen on accident in your world, I think is really precious.
Yeah.
It's something that I think kind of building an awareness for is really key. I mean, that's a big thing. Like whenever I'm teaching young students about, singing or about how to hear music, it's honestly a lot more about building awareness in these young people. And also as professionals, is kind of building awareness for this world around us because it's pretty noisy. Mm-hmm. And so we like have to kind of begin to discern and filter. And I think
I love the mental model of having, signal versus noise, because the world is mostly noise. And if you try to listen to all of it, you'll just be paralyzed and you can't write music or write a book or get in that creative space. Even as performers, we're not writing music, but we're part of the process in some way.
Well, I think you are, like writing music in a sense. I mean, one, like you both have, I know, improvised because I have been there with you when you've done it. But two, I mean, even think about interpretation. Like, is that a version of composition, you think? Like Yanka, like I'm curious, like when you play like the Brahms violin concerto, like do you feel like you're making some choices that, of course Brahms like would never have thought about, but your kind of active role in that, I think, makes you a really interesting agent in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the more I age, I think the more I feel like I'm making more of those decisions, like less in a subconscious way. Like I used to be like, oh, this sounds cool, so let me just do this little thing here. But now I try to be more like, okay, like what would this composer want? Like what kind of what is it that I should kind of take from here and then, just add my own interpretation. And I think in a way that's, I guess, composing. Not necessarily composing, but like
it's kind of a gray area, right? It's like it's like a halocline in the process. But I think it's something that, I hope that a lot of performers don't kind of feel like they're not actively involved in that. That's kind of one thing that's like so beautiful about like electronic music is like often people who write pieces for kind of like acoustic instruments with electronics, the person who's just kind of hitting the buttons on the sound system is considered equal, like to the performer is often considered equal, like to what the composer is doing. So I think it's a really interesting kind of Venn diagram there.
I had jotted down this, I remember reading something in grad school. So I had jotted down this question to ask you anyways about like what we just said, objectivity and subjectivity in music. And I'm forgetting the name of the paper, but I sort of reread, I found on my Google Drive a sort of review homework assignment from grad school. It was about a Brahms intermezzo, I want to say, but it was this debate about like, is music objectively there? And my job is to play what you wrote as the composer, or are we collaborating in a dual, composition kind of thing? And people land on different sides of that, but it sounds like you're landing on more of the, we're both, participating and collaborating side of it.
Yeah, I think I do. And it's really interesting because I spoke earlier about how much I love being able to make choices. And I do, because I'm a composer, and I'm very arrogant because I'm a composer. And I do kind of love being able to make decisions. Sure.
I mean,
but,
at least you're self-aware about it.
but for me, after I make the choices, that's like the step one of choices, right? That's like the first layer of my tiramisu. I kind of need to have collaboration to then make the other layers, right? I'll draw like another a parallel back to coffee. It's like I loved working in coffee in New York because I love the product. But what I loved more was being able to make choices about a product, sharing that with somebody, and having that act as a catalyst for conversation. Mm-hmm. Either with me, with someone else. Maybe they say, oh, I don't like that drink. Or in music, oh, I kind of like this, but like I don't really like that bar. Sometimes I'll say, well, okay, I kind of like that bar. But oftentimes I'll say, cool, I want to know why you don't like that bar. I want to kind of talk about this, because I very quickly had to break my ego in composition, because what I've found is that while it's going to always be present in some sense because I'm the author of something, it's kind of always living, right? It's like if I'm able to go back and look at my old catalog and make choices about something to change, why can't a person who's going to be actually playing that music and bringing it to life on a stage have an active role?
Yeah.
And I think it's just a really healthy part of a creative process, and it's something that I feel like a lot of people want but don't actively engage with because they're scared of kind of overstepping a line. There's no lines.
They're scared of making decisions, right? I mean, so when you make a decision, you put yourself out there and you say, this is, when you say make a decision, by the way, I think another way to phrase that would be to solve a problem of some kind.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you put yourself out there when you solve a problem in your way and you go, here's my solution, and then the world can now judge it. But as a composer, you probably have to just let go of caring.
Mm-hmm.
Once you decide, it's like, I decided, now I move forward.
Yeah, and I recall recently I had a commission from this school here in Georgia called the Woodward Academy for a piece for middle school band, which is an idiom that's kind of famous for having really awful music, a lot of really awful music.
Do you mean like performances because they're in middle school, or even the content of the music is awful?
The content of the music.
Yeah.
And so I tried to actively address this problem. So I spoke heavily with the director, who's a good friend of mine, who commissioned me. And I said, hey, I want to find a way so that your students feel like they're having an active role in this. And so what I did was I went to go visit with his students about 4 times until I delivered the final piece. Each time I would bring a snippet, maybe 16 measures, maybe half the piece, whatever it was. And I just kind of had them play it. And I wouldn't tell them anything. I would just say, hey, who has any thoughts on this? And of course, you'll, have the wise cracks in the back who are like, it needs more conga drums, like whatever it is. But every now and then you'll, have somebody who's like, well, I kind of like this ending, but I wonder if like maybe, like the French horn part was like a little higher. And I'm like, cool, let's experiment with that. And we try it and I like it. And I'm like, cool, that's a great idea. It's now in the piece.
Yeah.
And these young people are like, wait, hang on. I get to have a part in this, but like you're the composer. You're the one being paid for it, like for the piece. And I'm like, right. And you're the collaborator. So you are equally as important, if not more so, than what I'm giving you to perform.
I remember being in middle school and high school,
yeah.
and the whole idea of how a piece was written was such a mystery that if somebody had done that to me and said like, yeah, we could put an F sharp up there, I'm like, you can just do that? I thought there was some like rule book that you know, but it really is. It's just you can show kids that it's just putting notes down on a page in a certain way.
Yeah. And,
no offense.
And, well,
I mean, what do we do? We just make
sounds.
We make vibrations in the air in a certain way, right?
Right. But I think it goes even more past that. It's like, when, like in this piece, for example, there was like an effect at the end where I like had the students kind of sing this chord, like using their voice, and they kind of transition like into playing. And, a few of them had this idea to kind of have it, kind of get like, almost like peppered into the ensemble, like the playing, almost like you're like poking holes into like a piece of paper that has light coming through and have that kind of become this playing. And I didn't really like that idea personally, but this band wanted it so bad that I was like, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it, because you're feeling proud and happy with your part of this process completely negates whether I thought it was a good or a bad choice. It makes the piece and the process better.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a good choice,
Yeah. I wonder if Yanka has
cool.
any concept of sound for what middle school band is. Because obviously we talk about that. We were in middle school bands and we
really.
teach that age of students, and we just know what that, I'm just going to say what it's like it can be like some of the most awful sounds you could imagine.
No, I didn't grow up here. I didn't go to school here, so I have no idea. But I have a question, generally about education, like of composition. I was just curious, like if at what point, like if undergrad degree is more designed to be like, okay, so you need to write in various styles that existed, like expressionist music or like, serialist, like whatever. And then grad school is designed more like finding your own voice, or like at any point do you have to write in any specific style as a requirement? I was just curious.
Yeah. So I think that's probably true for a lot of musical disciplines. Like the undergrad is like the learning how, and the grad school is learning like why and what next.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's that really famous quote from Lee Hyla, who used to teach at Northwestern University. He died a few years back, but he has this quote where he says, "If anything goes, then nothing matters." Right. And so I think as a young person in composition or on trumpet or on violin, anything, at least for me, undergrad was a lot more just kind of filling in some gaps I did not have filled. There was some stuff I didn't know. There are some things I couldn't do on the trumpet, or things I didn't know about music, or things I didn't know were even possible about composition. And when I kind of had the road like initially paved, grad school was like, okay, let's choose our signs. Let's choose what color paint you want to, have on your road. Let's choose all these other things. So I definitely think you're spot on there, Yanka. With
I was just curious
kind
if
of how it's
anyone's
broken
like
down.
making you compose in a specific style that you absolutely dislike. Like, is that one of your requirements and you have to fulfill at any point?
So that was more of like an undergraduate
I
thing,
see.
and it was also not really as a composer. It happened often in my music theory courses.
Right, like
I
the same
see.
courses we had to take with voice leading.
Yeah.
and
Oh,
stuff.
Like you're told like to write a song in the style of Debussy, or you're told to write like a piano invention in the style of Bach, or like a string quartet in the style of Schoenberg. But just like these little short exercises to kind of make sure that you can apply the concepts you're learning in the course into some kind of practical understanding, which I think is beneficial as a composer or an educator or a performer or a musicologist. One thing, though, that was really interesting for me that I had happen on my senior year of my undergraduate studies was when I had decided to go to grad school for composition, which I almost didn't. I applied almost for trumpet, and I did apply for a few schools for trumpet, but I didn't pursue it. Was my teacher asked me to take a substantial portion of the first movement of Mahler's Second Symphony, Gustav Mahler's Second Symphony. And what he told me to do was to write it out by hand, note for note.
What
Just
was
the
reason
what?
of this assignment?
And I was like, why the heck would I do that? That sounds like an awful way to spend like a few weeks. And it was really interesting actually, because it's in the moment I was so furious. I was like, I go home every night. I spend like an hour doing like 6 bars of just like
Are
strings.
you copying this visually or transcribing it like from audio?
Visually.
Okay.
Visually.
I was
that
like,
would have been
"Man, dude."
impossible. Yeah, probably.
It was actually really fascinating, like to kind of feel what it might have felt like to write down a part of this kind of monumental symphony myself.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I didn't have any active agency in its conception, writing it down gave me this kind of urgency over the music. And I would kind of find myself having this really interesting parallel with, because, you know, I know how that piece goes, and there are times when it's getting more intense, and I'm finding my hand shaking more and more as I'm going, and I'm like, whoa, I'm just literally just like writing down whole notes here, like,
Mm-hmm.
like why is this impacting me? And it led to a few very interesting discussions with my old comp professor. His name was Fred Cohen. He's now the department chair at San Jose State University in California.
Nice. I like that idea. It reminded me when you were saying that, you know, the writer Neil Gaiman. He was on, I think it was Tim Ferriss's podcast, and he was talking about his writing process and how he has to use a pen on paper. And he has a very, very specific type of pen, like a fountain pen that he uses. And he takes these fountain pens to, there's a fountain pen hospital in New York. Like, it's, you know, it's a repair shop for these fountain pens that are like $150. But he said the way it just slides across the paper and becomes words. Imagine like, you know, the magic diary from Harry Potter, the way the writing just appears there. Like, he's like, it feels just like this. It slides across the page with it, like an ice skater kind of thing.
Another Harry Potter reference.
I mean, they're on HBO. We've been watching them, so, you know.
No, but I think you're right, though. I mean, there's something about kind of like the physical process of, you know, of notating. I mean, I myself, I don't write by hand often. I've got probably 4 or 5 pieces that I have done that way, but it's really beautiful. And
it's
and
more,
the friends
you feel
I
more
have,
of a connection for some reason, right?
Yeah.
I feel the same, weirdly enough, like as a performer, I occasionally will practice things off of a computer screen or an iPad or something. And I always feel more connected to the music when it's like an original copy in a book, not even a photocopy. Like for some reason, like the flimsy like photocopy paper that can just like blow off your stand is there's something more serious in how I engage with music when it's in like, you know, an official published book with like a real binding, and the pages are not like that white photocopy color. That something like triggers in me like, oh, this is a more serious endeavor. It's something I can't quite explain it, but
well, and it kind of ups the stakes.
yeah,
right?
It feels
because like if you want to change a note, you have to get your eraser. You have to separately get your eraser or your whiteout, and you have to actively erase a note from a piece of paper. Whereas on a computer screen, you know, you can hit like 19 notes and try them in a matter of like 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting, you know, and like I kind of draw some parallels here to like other professions, and I'm sure Yanka like can also kind of relate to this. It's like, you know, like a baker. If they want to change a recipe, they won't even know if they messed up something until it comes out of the oven. Mm-hmm. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Right?
So true.
And it's a lot like that, kind of writing music by hand sometimes, like especially if you're not kind of at a piano, like playing through it, which is an important part of the process for some people too.
And so you're comparing that, you mean, to the instant replay that you're able to do when you're composing on a computer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think it's why doing something by hand is a really beneficial, you know, like,
you know what else it does?
Or
it slows you down. I bet you have to compose much slower by hand, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And something about slowing down changes what you create, right? It's another limitation that kind of your idea can go forward in brain world, but it's limited by this. It's as if you have a fast computer, but your USB cable is from like 2001, and it's just like the data transfer is slowed down. There's a sort of pinch in your data transfer wire that it can't flow faster from hand to paper, even if the idea is running crazy in your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must be frustrating.
Well,
to do that.
I'm kind of curious, Yanka, like for you, let's say like you're learning like a new piece on your violin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's like a similar process if you don't have any kind of previous knowledge of the work, or if, you know, a composer like did not provide you with like a MIDI rendering. If you just have notes on a page and you're told to like interpret it, what's that kind of like initial process of kind of exploration like for you? Because it's not unlike actually writing the notes on a page for the first time. It's a lot like a performer looking at the notes for the first time. It's like a very similar process. Like, what's that like for you?
It is. It's very frustrating, I think, because like I actually remembered this thing like a couple of years ago. I had to play this Paul Rudder's string quartet that was only premiered once ever, and we were supposed to do the American premiere of it, which has never happened, hilariously, but at Tanglewood. Anyway, and I received the music. There was no recording of it, nothing, and it was just like the most complicated, like rhythmically, just like the lots of extended techniques and everything.
From the outside, it looked like she was like participating in like Navy SEAL training, like because I would go up to visit her or FaceTime, whatever, because she was up at this festival for the whole summer, and you would get home and just be like, it's fucked.
Yeah, this is never gonna happen. Like, this is never happening. Yeah. So, I mean, it is really, really frustrating to put something together, especially, okay, the reason why it never happened is because the score was filled with all kinds of mistakes. We couldn't even put it together. Like, it was very sloppily written, which is another problem. Then we reached out to the composer and he like, I think like edited the score and everything, but yeah, it gets quite frustrating, I think.
Didn't
like,
one of the
So, like,
performers
are there-
involved have a man's breakdown and they had to cancel it or something?
That's how it happened.
That's
And
the
then-
ending of that story.
Exactly, because we couldn't figure
like, are
out
there-
like how to put it together. Yeah, but
Are there any accounts, Yanka, of like the, you know, like the early great violinists who have had to premiere works, obviously like without hearing them because it didn't exist, you know, like 20 years ago?
yeah.
Are there any people who wrote about what that process was like? Like, who said, hey, I just got this concerto from like whoever, and like, here's what I think about it.
Interesting. Well, I think they usually closely worked with the composer, which makes it quite easy, and you can just have a dialogue about how it's supposed to sound like. But when the composer's not around, you're completely alone and you have no idea what to do about it. And especially if the music is not like, the score is not as like instructive to you about what to do, then you put your own interpretation, and there's always this doubt, like you never know if you're doing the right thing, if like that's what the person envisions. It's very difficult. Like Ostrak, for instance, premiered the Shostakovich Concerto, and I know they worked very closely. So like when you're listening to that recording, you know that's what Shostakovich wanted. So because like they were just like talking about it, and I know he even like changed the passage because he was like, I'm so tired, just like the beginning of the fourth movement, he's like, I'm tired, like get this out of my part, just give it to the winds and stuff like that. Like they were that closely working that it was like a both kind of process that worked both ways, that were giving each other
Talk about collaboration, like we were saying before, in that kind of thing where someone's like literally having a not just interpretive, you know, having an interpretation, but literally in dialogue with the composer to say, yo, this ain't cool.
This
like
is not
if somebody wrote
happening.
something for trumpet, I'm like, if you want me to play it, it's not going to happen. There might be someone out there that can do it. Almost definitely there is, but I can tell you 70% of trumpet players won't be able to play this without getting tired or whatever the context is.
Well, now for you, Luke, I'm a little curious. In your time working on the Baroque trumpet repertoire, that was a bit different, right? Because the composers were sort of writing something, but there was kind of this sort of understood universal style.
So much
Like, do you think
information was
that
left out of the music that
Yeah.
that people of that time would just know. For example, I say this to my beginning piano students when they're first learning about harmony, like and talking about like trying in without going into music theory, talking about how they had figured basses, right? So not all the I was just trying to explain to them like not all the notes were written, and the keyboard player has a lot of say in how those harmonies are going to be expressed, much like a jazz pianist can not necessarily compose their own piece, but the interpretive freedom is like way more than what we think of normally as like the performer is the robot who plays what's on the page.
So do you think that like that I'm curious, like, if you think that's a benefit that was sort of lost when kind of like the universal interpretation expectations sort of morphed, or do you think that it's just different now? You know, like in your experience playing both, you know, like you play Baroque and contemporary.
Yeah, I think in the
like,
Baroque world, there's just a lot more of that. Like, I'm playing the music. I'm trying to educate myself as to the style and what it would be like and all of that. But there's this like understood freedom of like interpretation. Have you read the music as speech? What's the forget the full title of that book?
I know what you're talking about, but I can't recall.
Yeah, so towards the beginning of that book, he's just talking about how much music performance and pedagogy changed once high quality recordings became a thing, and so much more emphasis was put on perfection and technical, details and evenness of sound and perfect articulation, all the skills involved to be perfect, that the risk taking and the expressivity is just inherently lower today than it was when people weren't so concerned with perfection and were more concerned with artistic expression, taking risks and all of that.
That's really fascinating, I think. I mean, what I kind of have gathered, like from hearing you and Yanka just speak about that, is that in the Baroque era, like you might say that it was
that's, by the way, people, that's like the 1700s ish dates approximate.
The performer's urgency and wow factor was kind of more in the presentation, and then now it's a lot more in the conception of works, which is really interesting. Like, I think, Yanka, like you were saying, like this great violinist worked with a composer, but, like back then, like in the Baroque era, you might hear a trumpet player play something by, Handel or something and say, wow, I have never heard someone add these other things like what this person did. That's fascinating. But now you won't really hear anything added into the Shostakovich Concerto, which is interesting.
True. Yeah. There's so much more room
I don't know. It's
interpretation in Baroque, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's similar to in jazz, where there's just an assumed level of improvisation that will happen. Jazz and Baroque music share a lot of similarities in that respect. I do have one other question to ask you, like a concept area before we wrap up here, which is, how do you think about the idea of having a standard in an artistic field such as music? And my prompt, I want to tell a quick story. Maybe you know about this thing, but my prompt for it is, do you know about, let's see, I wrote down the guy's name. Right. Okay. So in December 2019, this was spreading around social media, and I got curious enough to look into it. So do you know about the banana taped to a wall art piece?
I do.
Okay. So, the guy who made that art piece, he's this Italian guy named Maurizio Catalan. And he does a lot of comedy type art pieces. And this, I think this piece is literally called The Comedian. It's literally just a banana duct taped to a white background, and it sold for $120,000. And so I'm of two minds towards this, right? He by the way, he also has another art piece, which is a toilet that is made of pure gold, 18 karat gold, and it's worth $8 million. So he's just kind of, there's a point going on there. But here's a little bit more from this story. So it was on display in an art exhibit in Miami, and because the people who bought it for $120,000 decided to show it to the public, this New York-based performance artist guy named Datuna pulled a stunt and has his friend videotape it on his phone on Instagram Live, and he just went up to the banana on the wall, grabbed it off, and ate it. And that became his art piece. And the caption for that video said, "I love Maurizio Catalan's artwork. I really love this installation. It's very delicious." And I just thought, now I've spent 15 minutes reading and thinking about art, and maybe that was the whole point, right? So even a banana taped to a wall, like I started this thing being like, people are fucking crazy. How are they calling this art? How is it worth that much? But then like the people who spoke about it more seriously were like, that was the whole point of it, is to question what is art. You know, Andy Warhol has those paintings that are just like a bunch of Campbell's soup cans, like all stitched together, you know?
Do you know his like defense on why he painted that? Like
No. Andy Warhol's, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
He just says like, I just love soup. I have it every day. That's why I wanted to do it.
I love that.
Like
yeah, I'll link this in the episode notes. But yeah, literally, it's just all I think it's 32 different flavors or whatever.
Yeah.
How at the time he made it, Campbell's soup had all these different flavors, and he just put like a very, you know, certainly put together like of each of these soup flavors, and the explanation was, that's amazing. Like, I just love soup. You know, when you hear like that kind of reasoning, you just go, maybe that is art then, right? Like, there's something about like, it's just pure instinct. You know, I don't know. So anyways, how do you, that's my framing, like lobbing the ball to you. How do you apply that kind of thinking to music and defining what is good, what is, you know, high quality music versus like, you know, shit music, and who gets to decide?
Also, like composing, like, where do you draw the line? Like, how absurd can you get? Because sometimes I've seen absurd stuff that maybe I was being
that
unfair.
Performers roll their eyes at.
Yes,
yeah.
Like maybe I was being very unfair. Maybe there was something deep going on that I wasn't getting. But like, do you also get the same feeling sometimes? I'm curious.
Do you ever get the feeling you're hearing something and you're calling bullshit on it?
Yeah.
You know.
Wow, there's like 9 questions here. Okay, so it is interesting, right? Because if you look at the banana tape to a wall, that had value because we said it had value, right? If you look at, you know, at the craft beer industry, beer has value because other people say that it has value. If you look at the coffee industry, the coffee that's featured in that book has value because someone else said it had value. That's kind of the first level if you want to think about how you can gauge the actual value.
A negotiation of value between people. Yeah.
Because you then have to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, where if I put a beer that's not highly valued by the community into my glass that says this is the best beer I've ever had, that changes things, right? And so I think it's a really fascinating thing to explore, because you see a lot in composers, you know, how they talk about sort of the worth of their music, or kind of what they think of as good or bad, or composers who pull things from their catalog because they don't think it kind of fits their current language or whatever it might be. Or you read like a New York Times review of a piece of music, and you're like, how is this person reviewing this? And it's really interesting because there's a couple of factors at play. I think there's inherently this kind of dialogue, which we've kind of been talking about this whole podcast, about the composer, performer, audience kind of conversation that's always happening. And there are sort of immediate responses that are able to be seen by both the performers and the audience or a reviewer, where they can gauge somebody's reaction. So let's say they were to hear a piece and then the audience goes like, ugh, in disgust at a moment. That's going to be something that a reviewer has to figure out why that happened. I think that when it comes to identifying whether or not a piece is good, there's a couple factors, because I used to have this mindset that there are bad pieces of music. I used to think that way. I used to think like, you know, there's just cats who like aren't that good at writing music.
Well, they can't even hold a pen, so yeah.
Oh my god!
I'm going to edit that out.
Please just edit that out. I was going to say that,
yeah. Yeah, and it bothered me for a long time, because I was saying these things as someone who, I mean, even though I've had like a decently successful career since that point, I was saying those things from the perspective of someone who hadn't had a career and who hadn't really won anything and who hadn't had these big commissions and who hadn't been on the front page of a magazine with a review. And so I had to take a step back and kind of analyze why I thought that. I had to kind of tell myself, why do I think that this person is not writing good music? And it boils down a lot of times to what is different what kind of actively moves us as a listener in the process. Now, of course, there are these kind of more surface level things like, is there an issue with how their score looks, or like, is their voicing wrong, or is there
something
music
like
that's written,
easy
like,
to fix technically, like
like, is there voicing, in a range that's not going to be successful on like this instrument. But music is a lot more than that. Music is a lot more than just what's on a page, right? It's about the active experience of listening to this music, letting it come into your body in a given place, and seeing how you respond to it. So I've kind of taken the idea that there might be pieces of music that I don't enjoy listening to as much, but I have to concede the fact that they're a part of the fabric.
right.
The
pieces you like wouldn't be that the pieces you like without contrast to the pieces you don't like. They're part of the whole big picture.
And if you want to go back to like the banana on the wall with kind of how that value is given, like in composition, it's so interesting. Like a composer writes something, gives it to a jury or a reviewer or an audience, then that person literally has no more power over how that is perceived,
Mm-hmm.
and it's fascinating. But then, let's take a look at other great artists. I'll use Jackson Pollock as an example. I love Jackson Pollock's works. And if I think about them too long, I begin to spiral about why I love Jackson Pollock's artwork,
Mm-hmm.
or why I love Basquiat's artwork. And I don't know. There are people who are staunch critics of Pollock and Basquiat because they think, oh, it looks like, like a third grader threw paint at a wall, or looks like a first grader drew a dinosaur. But it's a lot more than that, right? It's about how a given piece of art or music or anything is perceived in that moment, which, to kind of tie this whole thing up with a bow, it's back to the coffee shop. I, willingly had pulled shots of espresso for customers that I knew weren't exactly in the parameters I wanted. And when I poured them a drink, they loved it all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Because the process of me sharing something with them was a lot more important than what was in the cup.
Oh, I really like this advice, actually.
Yeah.
Because like as performance,
same with performers. Yeah,
we sometimes have a hard time seeing that, I guess, as performance.
Well, we see the technical details as like, was that a successful performance? Whereas I think if you're just like spiritually going for it, people hear that. They don't hear a missed note here or a scraped note there. They feel what your intention was. I think it comes down to the feeling part. It's not intellectual as much as it is instinctual and feeling.
And music criticism is something that I have not really studied. I mean, I have been on the side of being a critic, but not knowing why I have been. And it's something that I think, like, when you read the great music critics, there actually is something there to kind of take away from, and it's a certain kind of sort of experience and appreciation for the art. But I should read up more about that kind of as a process, because it's an important part of our field, and it's a part that can make or break people's careers. And it's something that I think needs to be addressed, because it's something that does have a huge, profound impact in terms of kind of visibility or just like financial compensation. Like if you win an award or something because your piece was chosen, all these different things.
This could be a whole episode topic on its own. Maybe we'll have you back in the future to talk about that, because there are lots of directions it can go in. But let's end with a speed round. Ready for so here's how the speed round works. You can say pass on any question you don't want to answer. Nothing pops into your head. You don't actually have to answer in 10 seconds. You could take 10 minutes theoretically, but there's just 4 or 5 questions to finish us up. And, I'm calling it speed round, even though you don't have to force yourself to be speedy necessarily.
All right, I'm ready.
All right. Favorite composer?
Favorite composer? Ooh. Anders Hillborg.
Huh. That's not, I didn't know who you were going to say, but I thought you might say either Mahler or Bach or Strauss?
I mean, Bach was the first person who popped into my head, but then I was like, listen,
You're
I'm
like,
like
that's
this
too
podcast.
obvious
I
sounding.
can't say
I need
Bach.
something cooler sounding.
No, but Bach, I mean, Bach like is definitely, the first person who came to mind, and then Beethoven, of course, and then Hilborg, and then Ives is probably fourth. And then, but I mean, that's also not like including, songwriters or hip hop artists as composers, which if that was the game, it'd be a whole different answer.
Fair enough.
Sure.
Yeah. What's something you believe now that you did not believe 10 years ago? And then vice versa. What did you believe 10 years ago that you no longer believe now? That was like a pretzel question. It makes your brain go like, oh, shit.
I believe that winning competitions does not matter, which I used to think it did, because that's kind of how I gauged my self-worth. Like I told you, being in New York, I was kind of bummed out because I wasn't winning these things. And then I realized that that's not how I define myself. And so now I've realized that that's not important. And then something that...
Reverse
that,
it. Yeah.
So you just said something that you used to believe that you don't believe now. So what's something that you didn't believe in that you do now? You're like the inverse of what I just said.
Yeah. Well, no. Something different, I guess, is I believe now that not being alone in the music industry is really important. Right? I used to think that, like back when I was like an undergrad or like in high school, that it was all about just me kind of being someone that kind of other people made music with, as compared to being a person that is defined by the people I'm making music with.
Yeah, the collaborative part of it, and the connections, not only just like in terms of making music, but in just staying connected as a community. I found that to be really important during this whole COVID-19 pandemic stuff. There was a sense that the music community came together because we all got screwed in a very similar way in terms of income, right? I mean, I'm still not imagining when the next time we'll play a concert is.
In person, real concert.
Yeah, maybe like virtual stuff. She's going to start down in New World and play virtual concerts, I suppose. But New York Philharmonic just canceled their entire fall season. And I'm sure more orchestras, depending on the location, will follow a similar thing.
There was a really fascinating critique I actually read about like the New York Phil canceling their season. There's a composer here in Georgia who, I won't say her name, but there's a composer who holds a job at a college who I think put up a really interesting perspective on social media. As she was like, like the New York Phil has canceled their season. And what does that say to the rest of the world when probably one of the eminent orchestras of all time has willingly decided that they don't want to find a way to make something else than just having live music? What does that say to the world about the state of the orchestra if they are just unwilling to somewhere higher up? So you know what? Let's throw some money and try and make some initiatives.
Yeah.
Anyways,
I could see that going both ways. Yeah. Like on the one front, it's like, well, money's dictating that decision more than art. On another front, it's like, well, you try running an arts organization without caring about money, right? So yeah, I could see it going both ways. What do you think happens when you die? This is the one I predict most people will pass on.
No, I mean, I think that, you become a part of something more.
Yeah, I'm down with that.
Yeah.
Literally.
I mean, like, think about all the people that we've talked about in this podcast who are dead.
Yeah.
That's wild,
Yeah.
right? It's important, like people matter a lot all the time.
Yeah.
And
the idea that
unfortunately for composers, sometimes composers get more known when they pass away, which is sad.
Well, that's true of Bach,
but,
right?
Yep.
We mentioned him a lot.
Composers,
Yeah. All right. Last one is whatever will pop into your memory in the moment here. But what's the time you remember laughing the hardest?
Time I remember laughing the hardest. Oh, there's a lot.
I think I just thought of one where I was present that if somebody forced me to say, when did you laugh the hardest with Nathan, something popped in. So let me know if you know what I might be talking about, but answer the first one first.
The time that I can remember laughing the hardest. Okay, well, there's a time that I recall just being in such a state of shock I couldn't help but laugh. So it was one of my first few years in New York, and I had a roommate who I had just gotten in this kind of really fancy bag of coffee, kind of back to coffee, and this person had said, "Hey, I want to make some cold brew with this coffee." And I was like, cool, yeah, here's how you do it. This person had seen me make this coffee like hundreds of times, so I trusted that they knew how to make cold brew coffee. So I come home, and on the next morning, I wake up and I'm expecting there to be a delicious pot of cold brew coffee. And this person's like, yeah, sorry, there's no cold brew coffee. I'm like, what happened? And they're like, well, so a couple things. First off, I didn't grind the beans, and I put in whole beans into the coffee brewer, and I poured water over them. And then I realized my mistake, and so I just threw the wet coffee beans back into your electric grinder, ground them, and then
I remember this.
Kind of got stuck. So I put what I could back in the coffee machine. Anyways, I put water, but like, here's your liquid, and hand me this.
Oh my
glass
God.
that looked like.
Did your grinder get messed up at all?
I had to replace a few parts.
Oh gosh.
But no, laughing is so interesting. It's like laughing the hardest. I mean, I feel like it's all relative, but I mean, a lot of times, like, perhaps are inappropriate for this podcast, but I don't know. What do you have?
So I am losing the exact details, but it was something when we were brewing coffee, and it was either when you were in my kitchen and the side of my coffee brewer, it's called a Chemex, just broke, right? Weren't you just like holding it and the side just like randomly the molecules were like, we're done, boop, and it just burst open, and we were in the other room, and you were just like in shock, like you were like, I'm speechless. But it could have also been during one of our coffee brewing things at school. I want to say like one of us did something really stupid, like maybe it was you. Oh, it was you. I remember what it was. You were we were cleaning up for the day, and we were just like emptying out water from various vessels. And you just like, we were like cleaning up, and you had the thing filled with water, and you just poured it on the couch. And we were just like, Nathan, what are you doing? And like, you didn't do it on purpose. That. You were just like mindlessly like, this needs to be emptied of water. Because the whole Coffee Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday thing was just ridiculous. And we were just about to go to our standard Whole Foods. We always went to Whole Foods and spent all the money we made on like a giant lunch. Anyways, that's I think that's what my brain was thinking of. Anything else, Yanka?
I don't think so.
All right, cool. Well, I'm going to hit stop on the recording. Thanks for listening. We can say goodbye and chill for another minute. But
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank y'all for having me. Yeah, I mean, thanks so much. For anyone listening, you can go and hear some of this music I write on my website. There's a couple other cool things coming up, but you go find me online, and
we'll link
back on soon.
Send me all the places you want to link people to, and we'll put it in the episode notes.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Thanks for listening, and
bye.
Bye.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Exploring Kodawari. If you enjoyed it, we hope you'll consider sharing it on social media and with friends. You can also help us out by leaving a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Those help us more than you would think. And if you'd like to help us out in a more substantial way, consider going over to our website to make a donation through PayPal. Links are in the episode notes for this. You can do this as a one-time donation or a recurring monthly donation. All of that support will help us to set aside time in order to create content for the podcast and the blog. And finally, please get in touch with us and say hi, either on social media or privately through email. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.